Hey everybody, it's Emily at ARC Schooling, and today I'm very excited because I'm going to show you the official Build Your Library Level 11 book list. Is it finished? No. I'm not finished with level 11 yet. But I do have the book list done. It's took me longer than I anticipated. It's been a crazy year. What can I say? So, without further ado, this is huge. This is probably the biggest book list I've made so far for any of the levels. I may have gotten out of hand, but I think it's all important. I wouldn't take anything out. So, I'm just going to try to get through this as quick as possible so this isn't like a 45-minute video. We're going to start with the history. And I'm going to start with the spines. Cartoon history, of course. This is the volumes 1 and 2 of the modern world. He has like volumes 1 through 3 of History of the Universe, and then it turns to the cartoon history of the modern world. There's volumes 1 and 2. Those are the spines, and it's the same format, really witty, cartoony. It's fun. And very thorough. I'm also still using the continuation of the World History in Documents, Comparative Reader. It's a really great resource. We're going to continue with that, as well as the Atlas of World History. We're going to continue with this book as well. So those are all continuations of what was used in Level 10. And I've also added the history book, Big Ideas Simply Explained. And this is by DK. I really liked this. I picked it up just to look at it. I didn't, with no intention of using it for anything. I just thought it looked like a neat book. And then I was like, you know, I wish I'd put this in level 10. Maybe someday this will get added into level 10 as well. But it's just a really great resource. Those are the history spines. Now I'm going to show you the books that are used in order through the year. So first we have Before Columbus by Charles C. Mann. And this is the Americas of 1491, so this gives you a look at what was happening in America before the Spanish came and while the Spanish were here. So it's pretty concise. This is the younger version. There's an adult book, but it was like 500 pages, and I was just it's a little much. So I wasn't sure how many of those big books I wanted to include this year, but this is illustrated. It's very well done. And I think it's still relevant for a high schooler to read. Then I included The Prince by Machiavelli, and mostly because it comes up in the cartoon history, and I was like, I really should include that. And it's really short, so I figured it wouldn't be very intimidating, even though it is rather dense. It's still pretty short overall. And then I have the Tudor, The Cheeky Guide to the Dynasty by Barb Alexander. I am a little bit Tudor obsessed. I really wanted to include something on the Tudors, but there's a lot of like really meaty resources or that are very specific. So it's like Henry VIII's wives, or a book about Mary Queen of Scots, or a book about Henry the Se- So there's too many books that are like specific. I wanted something that was going to cover all of it, but without being too dense. And this is just a really fun little book, and it's really informative. I mean, I already knew most of the stuff in it, so I don't think I learned anything new, but I think for a teenager who doesn't really know a lot, I think they'll find this really fun and engaging. Then I have Shakespeare by Bill Bryson, The World as Stage. I love Bryson's writing. I just love everything he does is wonderful. It's very witty, very interesting, very thorough. I learned a lot reading this. I mean, Shakespeare is sort of an enigma anyway. There's so little about him, and everything else is just conjecture, so I really like that he points that out a lot. Like, really, we don't know what was happening. We can speculate. But yeah, I think this is a really great resource. Then I have Galileo's Daughter by Davis Sobel. I really loved Longitude. I read that and scheduled it into level 8, I believe. And I've been wanting to add more of her stuff somewhere, and I needed a book about Galileo or the science of that time period, and after looking over several resources, I thought this was the most readable and most engaging. This takes a look at the life of Galileo through the lens of his daughter, although really, I feel like his daughter was just the hook. You do learn a little bit about what her life was like, though she was a nun in a monastery, but she was very much in tune with what her father was doing. She helped him write his books. She was right there with him for a lot of his life, so I found that to be interesting. There's a lot of letters. We only have her letters to him, though. Somehow all of his letters to her got lost, which is just sad. I want to know what the other side of that correspondence was, but it was very interesting. Then I have The Lost King of France by Deborah Cadbury. This is about the French Revolution through the lens of the youngest son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and what happened to him, and the mystery of what happened to him, about how nobody knew what happened. He was locked in prison and then no one ever saw him again. And there was speculation that they tortured him and he died of just malnutrition and disease, but some think he might have escaped. So there was a whole slew of pretenders that came out of the woodwork saying, "No, I'm the lost prince," and people believed them because there was no way to contradict it. Well, anyway, this shows how the revolution happened and why the revolution happened and all of that, but through this very specific lens, and I thought that was really interesting. I learned a lot. I found it fascinating. Next up, we have King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild. Hochschild? I don't know how you say his name. This is all about how Belgium pretty much raped Congo and took the land and just decimated the people. It's really horrific what happened there, and all in the name of colonization and money. And it was very sad to read about what happened to the people of the Congo and how they were treated and how people were speaking out about it and being ignored because nobody really cared what was happening so long as money kept coming in. And yeah, it was interesting to read about, but also really sad and upsetting. Next up, I have Tesla versus Edison, The Lifelong Feud That Electrified the World by Nigel Cawthorne. Pretty self-explanatory. Lots of first-hand accounts of what happened, primary sources, and just sort of a look at both of their lives and how they came to where they were in that time and how they came to their inventions and all of that. It was very interesting to read. I have The War to End All Wars, World War I by Russell Freedman. I love Russell Freedman's books. He's great. This was just as good as all the other ones I've read. This is all about World War I, the battles, all of everything you'd want to know, like how it started, who caused the war, why it happened. Next up, I wanted a book on World War II, just like, that was similar to this. I wanted something like that. And the resource that I thought I found didn't work. I was very frustrated because it was this huge book full of pictures, awesome. It looked amazing. Never once did it mention the Holocaust. I looked in the index thinking maybe I'm missing it. And the word Holocaust was not even in the index. Nor were concentration camps. And I was like, how can you even talk about World War II and gloss over that situation? Like, it rubbed me the wrong way. So, I started thinking, what would be the most important takeaway about World War II? You get kind of the basic information from the other spine resources, so I was thinking to myself, what takeaway do you need to have? So, I found these 3 books. First, you're going to read Night by Eloise, and this is his account of what happened to him and his father during the World War II in the concentration camps. He and his father struggled through the camps and tried to survive, and yeah, it's harrowing, but really important. So I really wanted to include that. Then I found this book, which was fascinating. This is The Boys Who Challenged Hitler, Knud Peterson and the Churchill Club by Philip Hoos. Yeah, this is about a group of boys who lived in Denmark, And they were just so frustrated with their country's leaders who just sort of bent over backwards and let the Nazis come on in because they didn't want to put up a fight. Meanwhile, in Norway, the Norwegians were not bowing down to the Nazis, and they were fighting back, and Knud Peterson was just a 13-year-old boy, and he was like so inspired by the Norwegians fighting that he decided if his government wasn't going to do anything about it, he was. So he and his friends started a club, and they did everything in their power to sabotage the Nazis, and they stole their weapons, they just did whatever they could, and they were eventually caught. And yeah, what happened to them was awful, but also really, really inspiring. And very interesting to read about. As a mother, though, I was sort of like, oh my god, if my children did something like that. But I would be proud, but also like, you could die. So it was a little bit terrifying, but very inspiring. And then I have Hiroshima by John Hersey. This is his journalistic account talking to the survivors of Hiroshima about what happened. Very interesting to read about, but also very upsetting. And finally, the last history book is Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea by Barbara Demick. Fascinating look at the lives of people living in North Korea. Scary and fascinating, and just how is this happening in modern day? It doesn't feel like it could really happen, but it is. Those are the history books. Next, I want to get into poetry, because it's a nice short pile. I only have 2 poetry books to talk about. First up is Why Poetry by Matthew Zapruder. This is all about why you should care about poetry, why you should read it, and why it's for everybody. It's not just for academics or people who are poets. It's for everyone. And I loved that he kind of made it easy to see why we should read poetry, but also how poetry works and why poets do the things they do. And he took a lot of poems and dissected them for us. And I loved that. It also inspired me to want to write poetry a little bit. Which leads me to the book we're using for actual poetry is The Making of a Poem, a Norton Anthology of Poetic Forms. This book is wonderful. It tackles a variety of poetic forms. So you get the villanelle, the sestina, pantoum, sonnet, the ballad, the pastoral, the ode, and open forms. Explains the rules for each form and then gives a bunch of examples of that form of poetry. And it's wonderful. It covers a really wide range of poets. It does a little bit of an insight into one specific poet for each section, and it's just great. I'm going to use this book to teach those forms, but also give your child prompts to write their own form for each one, so you'll have a notebook full of their own written poetry by the end of the year for each form. It's going to be great. I'm excited about that. So those are poetry. Now let's get into the literature. I have a lot of really great books. I'm going to try to talk about these fast so we don't get too hung up on me going into why I loved all of them, but they're all wonderful books. First up is The Knife of Never Letting Go by Patrick Ness. This is a story about a group of people who colonized a new planet, and that planet is very different from anything they were expecting. One, there's life on it, so the colonization of this planet mirrors the colonization of Europe taking over different places around the world, so I thought that would be a really relevant book to include. But it's also a fascinating science fiction story all on its own. On this planet, men have noise as well as animals. And basically that means that everything that pops into their head is radiated out for everyone to hear or sometimes see. It's sometimes even a visual. But animals have noise, so you can understand what they're thinking. And men have noise. Women do not, but they can hear the men. So it's a really interesting look at what happens there. This is a first in a trilogy. I highly recommend reading the whole thing, but I only scheduled this one. Next, I have The Gold Eaters by Ronald Wright. This is a story about the Spanish colonizing Peru and the end of the Incan civilization as seen through the eyes of Woman, who is a boy at the beginning, and by the end of the novel, he's like a 30-year-old man, I believe. So it kind of shows over his lifetime how the Inca went from a huge civilization to nothing because of the Spanish coming in and raping and pillaging and stealing all their gold. And one of the things I want to point out too that I was aiming at in this whole thing is I wanted to not just show history as dates and names, but the perspective of people who lived it, because I feel like that often gets overlooked when you're dealing, especially in high school with history. You're so hung up on like, we got to get all the dates and all the names of the battles and all of that, and that can kind of get boring. So I really wanted to make sure you got the perspective of the people who lived it. Next up, I have Queen's Own Fool, a novel of Mary Queen of Scots by Jane Yolen. And this is all about Mary Queen of Scots and her fool. And her fool in this story is just someone who she wanted to tell her the truth. It's a girl named Nicola who she found in an acting troupe, and Nicola has this just no filter on her mouth, and she just says things. And while some people worried that would get her into trouble, Mary thought it was really useful, and she wanted someone who was going to tell it like it is. And so that's what the story's about. It's her perspective of what happened during Mary's reign in France and then Scotland. Next, I have a Shakespeare play. We're going to be reading Macbeth. I've tried to include a play in every year from 8 up, and so this one I picked for this year was Macbeth because it's one of my favorites. It's a really fun play to read. Next up, I have The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. This is a science fiction novel about what the universe could be like if everyone was nice. I loved the just range of alien life that she included. I loved how open and accepting everybody was. I loved just everything about this book. There is some language and some very minor sexual content, though it just sort of mentions that it happens. It doesn't actually go into graphic detail that it happened. But yeah, there is some language. If that's an issue for you, I'm sorry. But the overall novel was so great, and just everything, it's the kind of science fiction that made me smile like a fool the whole time I read it. Next up, I have Rebel Queen by Michelle Moran, and this is all about when Britain took over in India and started colonizing India, and how the people of India did try to fight back, unsuccessfully, but they tried. And this is all about Queen Lakshmi and her Durgadasi, which were these women warriors, bodyguards, who were very intelligent, very knowledgeable, and knew how to use all these different weapons. They were just a bunch of badasses, and you follow a girl named Sita through becoming one of the Durgadal and what happened during the reign of Queen Lakshmi, and it was really, really interesting. Next up, we have The Scarlet Pimpernel by Baroness and Mooska Orczy. And this is a story about the French Revolution and the Scarlet Pimpernel, who was someone from England who was rescuing the aristocrats from France to keep them from being executed. And I need a little tea break. Talking about all these books is thirsty work. We have Homegoing by Yagyasi. This is a story about two sisters who didn't know they were related. They've never met each other in Africa, and how they become separated. One sister stays in Africa and her lineage continues there. The other sister gets taken to America as a slave and her lineage continues there. So you get to see basically what the slave trade did to Africa and Africans overall, and it's very upsetting. I loved that you get to kind of jump from generation to generation, so you get one character in that lineage for each chapter, and it goes back and forth, and you see like how it affected the people who were still in Africa, and you see how it affected the people who were taken as slaves to America. It was beautiful, it was very well written. I think everyone should read it. Because I have so many dark books, I did try to include some lighthearted reads so it isn't just all depressing the whole year. So in addition to The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, I've also included Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. This is just a really fun classic children's book about this magician who has this moving castle and a girl under a spell, and their lives intertwining together, and it's fun. It was a really fun read, really cute, just another, like, makes you smile kind of book, because let's be honest, when you're reading about modern history, you need something that makes you smile once in a while. Next up, we have The Last Days of Night by Graham Moore. This is historical fiction, all about the feud between George Westinghouse and Thomas Edison, as told from the perspective of Paul Cravath, who was George Westinghouse's lawyer. This was a really fun book, and it was really interesting. I love reading about real people told in a story instead of just a nonfiction, like, here's what happened. I love when a really well-written novel tackles things like that. It was really interesting to read. I loved, like, I kept finding myself Googling because I wanted to, like, see what they looked like. I'm like, well, who does everyone look like, so I can picture them properly in my head, and I love this book. Next up, I have All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque. This is a classic about World War I. It's said to be the greatest war novel of all time. And this really, it was a great pair up with The War to End All Wars by Russell Friedman. It just really highlights how completely and utterly pointless this war was and how frustrating it must have been to be one of the men caught up in it, because so many men enlisted with these heroic ideas in mind, and it's so sad and so frustrating, and yeah, but it's a really beautiful book. Next up, I have The Librarian of Auschwitz by Antonio Iturbe. This is the true story in novel form of Dita Kraus, who was a librarian in Auschwitz. This was fascinating to read about. I've read a lot of World War II books and a lot of books about the Holocaust. And this is the first one I've ever read that was about the family camp. Basically, all you really need to know going into this is that the Nazis were hoping to trick the world into thinking that they were just rounding up the Jews and letting them have this nice little camp, and they were all there with their family, and everyone was happy, and they were separate, sort of a separate but equal situation. No, they used this camp as a ruse. Basically, they had a ghetto, Terezin, where they made a documentary basically showing how great this little ghetto was and why they were treating the Jews well. And then they murdered the man making the documentary so that he wouldn't tell anyone what was really happening. And then they set up this family camp right in the front of Auschwitz so that should anyone come in, they would see this camp first, and it would all look nice and good. They had children, they had a school, they had families together. It was all great. Except, of course, the people there were starving, and, you know, they weren't happy to be there. They knew what was happening. I mean, they were right there. They could see through the fence that that's the death camp. They could watch the bodies being cremated. So they knew what was going on in the camp, but they were hoping that, you know, the family camp would mask that if should anyone come see. And because they had a school, but they weren't allowed to actually use books to teach the children, some were smuggled in, and Dita Kraus was in charge of keeping the books and keeping them secret and hiding them. And she was only 14. And it's just, she's a badass, and I loved this book so much. I loved how it weaved real people. Everyone mentioned in this book was a real person. And yeah, it was just a really, really great book. This is another 5-star read for me. Next up, I have Barefoot Gen 1 by Keiji Nakazawa. This is a graphic novel. This is a manga, actually, although it's not backwards like regular manga. But it's all about World War II from the perspective of regular Japanese people. Specifically in this book, the father in this family opposes the war, and he really wants Japan to surrender, but Japanese people are told that they cannot. They have to be pro-war or they're traitors. And so this family gets labeled as traitors because the father opposes the war. And it's their perspective all the way up until the bombing of Hiroshima. It takes place in Hiroshima. So at the end of this book, Hiroshima is bombed. So I believe there's more in the series because it says book 1. I haven't sought out the rest of them, but I am interested to read more. I thought this was a very well done story. It was very engaging. I really liked the style of it. It was really good. Next up, I have Revolution is Not a Dinner Party by Ying Chang Castine, and this is about a girl who is living during the Cultural Revolution, and her father is a doctor. Intellectuals were frowned upon, and it's all about how they survive this time. And it was really sad, but really interesting, and it does get hopeful by the end. And finally, because again, so many heavy books in a row, I needed something that was going to be lighthearted and happy. We round out the year with Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. This is one of my favorite books. They are two of my favorite writers, and this book is hilarious. It's a look at the apocalypse from the perspective of an angel and a demon who are trying to stop it because they happen to enjoy Earth and they don't want to see it end. We're almost done. Next, I want to talk about art. I'm using Drawing Lab 52 Creative Exercises to Make Drawing Fun by Carla Sondheim. This is from Mixed Media. This is a straight up how to draw book, but not really how to draw so much as just drawing. And it gives you activities to do. Each lab gives you something new to try out. And I just think it's a lot of fun. Even if you're not good at art, even if you feel like you're not very talented, it's still fun to practice and to learn how to draw as well as you can. You may never be the next great artist, but that's fine. It's fun to experiment. So that's what this book's all about. The elective this year is the history of the English language. And so I found this book, Excavating English by Ruth A. Johnston. This is a hands-on dig into the multicultural roots of English from 4000 BC to the present day. And it's set up as kind of a work text, activities to do, links to videos and things. Really, really interesting. So that's going to be the spine, as well as Latin and Greek roots. I've talked about this in a previous video, so I'm not going to go too far in, but these are just basically Latin and Greek root workbooks. So it's vocabulary study. And I thought that would be a necessary piece of learning about the language. And then 3 books that we're going to be reading this year. To round it out, I have Bill Bryson's The Mother Tongue, English and How It Got That Way. The Professor and the Madman, A Tale of Murder, Insanity, and the Making of the Oxford English Dictionary by Simon Winchester. And I have Word by Word, The Secret Lives of Dictionaries by Corey Stamper. All of these will give you a great view of the English language and dictionaries and how the words come to be, and I just think it'll be a lot of fun. One more tea break. Finally, let's talk about science. The science this year is chemistry, and we are continuing on with CK12 because it's a great resource. It's free. I'm all about that. If I can find something inexpensive, textbooks are so expensive. And so we're using CK12 for chemistry, and the books we are using to round that out, I have Periodic Tales, A Cultural History of the Elements from Arsenic to Zinc, and this is by Hugh Aldersley Williams. This is a really interesting book all about all the elements. Each story covers a little bit about each element. It's really, really well done. We're also using Napoleon's Buttons, 17 Molecules That Change History by Penny LeCouture and Jay Bryson. Again, a really interesting look at molecules through history and how people discovered them and what they used them for. Really interesting work. Yet another Sam Keen book, Caesar's Last Breath, Decoding the Secrets of the Air Around Us, another book about molecules. And it's just a really well done book. I like Sam Keen's writing. It's easy to understand, but also really interesting. And finally, I'm a little bit stuck between these 2 books. One of them is going to be scheduled and one will just be a recommendation. I can't decide. I have Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women by Kate Moore, all about the girls that were employed in painting the clocks and things with radium and how they got really sick from radiation poisoning and no one believed it had anything to do with the radium. And they had to fight the company. And it's a really compelling story about a tragic event involving radium. And then we have What Einstein Told His Cook, Kitchen Science Explained by Robert L. Wolk. And it talks about things like salt and sugar and how chocolate is made and all sorts of things to do with kitchen science. So it's really interesting. I've heard good things about both. I just can't make up my mind, so I'm kind of stuck. I know I can't squeeze both in. There's just not enough time. Of course, there's never enough time. Too many books, not enough time. It's always a problem. So one of these is definitely going to be included. One will be recommended. I'm going to figure that out in the next couple of weeks because I'm still typing up and getting everything scheduled. This is the last piece of the puzzle that I can't fit. But I didn't want to wait another couple of weeks till I let you guys know the book list. So that is it. That is a lot of books. It's a lot of books. But I hope that you guys are as excited as I am because this has been a lot of fun to write. A little bit stressful because it took me longer than I anticipated and I have to have it done. But so much fun. So many great books this year. I do not have an actual date for when Level 11 will be released. My goal is the first or second week of August. I don't know how realistic I'm being with that, but that is my goal. It might be closer to the end of August. As soon as it's done, I will announce it. I will be having a sale to celebrate, but also like our summer sale. So you'll know as soon as it's done. I'm going to be like screaming it in the mountaintops, just like, I've finished, it is done. I'll be so happy. So I'm planning on taking a really great vacation break from work for at least a month before I start diving into the next project. If you have any questions, let me know down below. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Happy reading. Bye.